Daniel Levy was the chairman of Tottenham Hotspur for almost a quarter of a century. His reign came to an abrupt and potentially fractious end in 2025. The last 7 years of Levy's reign were potentially what led to his downfall and him being thrown under the bus by the Lewis family. So in this video we will look at the sequential manner, the downfall of Daniel Levy, the events that led to the disaster final parts of his spell. Welcome to TCU Spurs and come along as we look into the last years of Daniel Levy at Tottenham Hotspurs. The height of Levy's popularity at Spurs was in 2019 when the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium was opened and Spurs made their first ever UCL final. However, if you ignore these two things, there were massive problems which were being ignored. The main reason for the success of Spurs during and the man responsible for taking Tottenham into the UCL final was Mauricio Pochettino. Poch was appointed in 2014 and his main objective was to get Spurs into the UCL by the time new stadium opens. However, Pochettino got Spurs into UCL 3 years in a row before the stadium even hosted a single game, and when the stadium was open, Spurs were in the UCL final. Between 2014 and 2019, Spurs finished second and third in successive seasons, reached two FA Cup semi-finals and the League Cup final, finished above Arsenal for the first time in 22 years and started doing it for consecutive years and was having wins over almost all the big teams in the Premier League and the Champions League. This team had the most connection with the fans, one of the best, if not the best, in the league in every position played for Spurs in that position. In 2016-17, Spurs were one of the youngest teams in the league and had a team that was almost ready to take the final step. However, your team will go old with the time and some players will drop off due to injuries, and there will be a requirement to refresh the squad. At the end of 2017-18 season, the season in which Spurs had to deal with playing the full season at Wembley and much less investment in the squad in comparison to other Big Six clubs, Spurs were able to finish third in the league with their second highest ever points tally in the Premier League era. However, heartbreaking losses against Juventus in the Champions League and Manchester United in the FA Cup semi-final meant the season ended trophyless. And in this backdrop, Poch, after the final game of the season against Leicester, demanded big decisions in the summer. And he was able to see that Spurs needed some serious quality. Danny Rose had an injury-ravaged season and was not at the same level as before. Moussa Dembele's influence in the midfield was waning, and injury had affected Victor Wanyama. Similarly, Spurs had overly relied on Christian Eriksen for creativity, and an additional creator was required. To add to the matter, a large number of the Spurs first-team players, 9 in total, reached the World Cup semi-final in 2018, highest in all the clubs. However, considering all of the reasons that we've discussed, Tottenham actively decided not to sign a single player in the summer of 2018, the first ever club to do so. Now, there were several reasons why this happened, namely, Spurs already had 18 non-homegrown players for the UEFA and so needed to sell some non-homegrown players. Sales of players like Toby Alderweireld or Danny Rose or Moussa Dembele did not happen, and a lot of finances were tight for the new stadium. However, you cannot ignore the fact that this was not good enough and Spurs had not planned or were not prepared enough for this. Further, the summer transfer window of 2018 was shortened to end before the start of the season, unlike at the end of August or start of September that we see today. And Spurs were one of the clubs that voted for this. And even though Pochettino was already against this idea, considering the fact that under Levy, Spurs always signed players late in August, this decision was completely baffling for Spurs to vote to shorten the window. And Spurs massively suffered because of that in 2018-19 season, with multiple injuries to key players, eventually leading to a complete collapse in the second half of the season, where Spurs lost 7 of the last 12 league games, which was overshadowed by the heroic run to the UCL final. So, coming into 2019, the problems were bigger, and this time the squad really needed a rebuild. Players such as Toby Alderweireld, Christian Eriksen were coming to the end of their contracts, and their midfield really needed a refresh. And you would think reaching a UCL final, having the stadium open, consistently qualifying for the Champions League, that Spurs would be an attractive destination, and with good signings, Spurs could finally take the next step and win something. But this is where the contradiction of Daniel Levy comes in. Daniel Levy wanted to see Spurs win the trophies, compete for the Premier League, and reach more UCL finals, but he was afraid or unwilling to push to the next level in terms of transfer spend or wage structure. Spurs under Levy had a rigid wage structure, which was set at 100k till 2018, when Harry Kane was given a new contract and was extended to 200,000, which has continued until the end of his tenure, and only now in this summer are we seeing the club breaking away from that. In the summer of 2019, Spurs did spend some money, but not in the manner that would really push the club forward. Spurs would sign 4 players, but only one of them, that is Tanguy Ndombele, would arrive before the start of the season and during the preseason. Jack Clark was also signed alongside Ndombele but was sent to loan to Leeds. Lo Celso and Sessegnon were signed on the deadline day, and Sessegnon was injured when we arrived. Further, there was no departures as many were expected, meaning the squad was not in a good place in terms of harmony and led to a bad start to the season. And by November, with Spurs being 14th in the table, Pochettino was sacked. And this is where Daniel Levy made a serious miscalculation. Instead of recognizing the failings in the squad and the structure of the club, which had led to a poor transfer strategy for 3 years, both in terms of incomings and outgoings, he gambled on Jose Mourinho, who by this point had lost the magic that had made him the special one. The idea of bringing Mourinho was that he would come in, have a good managerial bounce to get Spurs back into the top 4 and maybe win a trophy, and then eventually when things will fall apart, we will then do a rebuild. But it would not work out in that manner. After a decent start under Mourinho, the season would fall apart when both Kane and Son would be injured in the early parts of 2020. And Spurs looked like limping to the end of the season. However, we're lucky that we had the lockdown of 2020, and post-lockdown both Kane and Son returned, and Spurs were able to get 3 wins and 3 draws from the final 7 games to qualify for the Europa League. Then came the summer of 2020, where Spurs would do the second mistake that Daniel Levy consistently made in summer transfer window. That was constantly changing the plan mid-window. Going into the window, the idea was to sign a DM, an attacking midfielder, and an attacking right back and a centre back. However, after getting Pierre-Emile Højbjerg and Matt Doherty, Spurs would lose the first game against Everton and panic. The initial tactical plan of Mourinho was to play a lopsided system with the right back pushing high and Ben Davies and left back sitting up and making a back 3. However, Spurs got an opportunity to sign Gareth Bale on loan and Sergio Reguilon from Real Madrid, and they took it, completely shifting the plan under Mourinho. Now, Reguilon was a more attack-minded left back, and Gareth Bale in his later part of his career was not someone who was going to track back and put in the defensive work. However, Gareth Bale did contribute 16 goals and 3 assists in all competitions, but only played under 1000 minutes in the league. And Spurs would consistently struggle with the balance of the side, and football under Mourinho would become dull very quickly. Yet, Spurs would have a good start to the 2020-21 season, also getting to the top of the league in December, reaching the knockouts of the Europa League and the final of the League Cup. However, things would again fall apart in the January of that season. Losses to West Ham United, Manchester United, Man City, Arsenal, Chelsea, along with losing 2-0 after being 2-0 up in the first leg Europa League round of 16. Mourinho would be sacked, but the timing would be crazy. Mourinho was sacked 1 week before the League Cup final, a chance to win the first trophy since 2008, and in the middle of the whole European Super League fiasco. This is something for another time, but after sacking Mourinho, Spurs would appoint Ryan Mason as an interim manager and would go on to lose the final under him, which was within 6 days of his appointment, and would eventually finish 7th and play in the Conference League. After the sacking of Mourinho, promises were made by Levy and the board to return to the free-flowing attacking football, and a list of managers was drawn and circulated, which included Julian Nagelsmann, Brendan Rodgers, Eric Ten Hag, and Graham Potter. However, none of the 4 would arrive. Then there was news of return of Pochettino, who was reportedly unwilling at PSG. But then he would also not arrive. Then Spurs would try to bring in Fabio Paratici and Antonio Conte, who had left Inter Milan after winning Serie A. However, Antonio Conte would choose vacation over the stresses of Tottenham Hotspur. Paratici though would still arrive and he would lead the new era of Spurs, and he would be the man to hire the next manager. And the man he chose first was Paulo Fonseca. And for a couple of weeks, everybody believed that Paulo Fonseca was going to be the next Tottenham manager. All the fans warmed up to him after initially not being happy, considering it a swap between Spurs and Roma, with Mourinho taking over at AS Roma. However, eventually Paratici would just snap and instead hire Nuno Espirito Santo, the former Wolves manager, completely contradicting the earlier promise of returning to free-flowing attacking football. Now, Paratici, to his credit, would improve the outgoings in 2021, and Daniel Levy did one thing great in this period, and that was to hold on to Harry Kane against the desire of his Arsenal fan brother. But Nuno Espirito Santo never really appealed to the fans, even though he would get off to a perfect start with 3 1-0 wins in August and a manager of the month, with Spurs being top of the table. Things would completely unravel in September with 3 consecutive heavy derby defeats against Crystal Palace, Chelsea and Arsenal, and 5 losses in his first 10 league games. Nuno would be sacked, with large number of fans calling for him and Levy to be sacked after a 3-0 loss against Manchester United. And this was the first time that publicly Daniel Levy was being called out by the fans in large majority. And this was the reaction that forced Daniel Levy to convince Antonio Conte to come to Spurs. And as Conte put it, the infectious enthusiasm of Daniel Levy brought me here. And Conte did the trick. He got Spurs back into the top 4 in 21-22 season. And this led to equity investment by ENIC into the Spurs for the first time in a long time, with ENIC giving 150 million to invest into the squad. And Spurs would yet again show ambition with signings made in June, with Perisic on free, Foster on free, Yves Bissouma from Brighton, followed by club record signing of Richarlison, Clement Longlegs from Barcelona, Jet Spence and Destiny Udogie, although Udogie would be loaned back to Udinese. However, if you look at all these names, there were none which would really improve the first 11 players. They were all good squad players, but not really going into the starting level 11, maybe with the exception of Perisic. And the season would not go to the plan. After a decent start, the season yet again fell apart in the second half, as Spurs would be eliminated from the 3rd round of League Cup, 5th round of the FA Cup and the round of 16 of the UCL. And Conte would sack himself with the infamous press conference after the 3-year draw against bottom club Southampton. He would be sacked after that press conference. Christian Stellini, his deputy, would take charge before being sacked after the horrible 6-1 loss to Newcastle. And for the first time since 2008-9 season, Spurs would finish outside the European places. Also, during this period, Fabio Paratici would get banned from footballing activities for his role in Juventus falsifying their accounts. So yet again, Spurs would be looking for a new manager. And for the 5th season in a row, Spurs would start with a different man in charge than the one that was in charge the previous season. And this time, the man chosen for the job was Ange Postecoglou from Celtic. And in summer of 2023, Harry Kane would depart Spurs, joining Bayern Munich. However, this window was probably the best summer window in recent memory, with Mickey Van der Ven, James Maddison, Brennan Johnson and Guillermo Vicario all joining and all becoming regular starters under Ange Postecoglou. During this time, Levy would replace Paratici with Johan Lang, which would also turn out to be controversial to say the least, and the jury is still out on him. Now, Ange's first season would be a mixed bag. With an excellent start, Spurs would go top of the 10 games of the season, playing the best and the most exciting football in the league. However, injuries to Van der Ven and Maddison against Chelsea would take the wheels off the season, and an inconsistent second half would lead to a 5th place and a Europa League qualification. The summer of 2024 would turn out to be mediocre, with Spurs signing only Dominic Solanke and 3 teenagers in Archie Gray, Lucas Burwell and Wilson Odegaard, and Spurs not signing a single defender, which would come back to bite them, as Spurs would suffer a massive injury crisis in the winter months, resulting in a poor run of form. And this poor run of form would lead to Postecoglou shifting attention to the Europa League and completely giving up the league. And the Australian would deliver on his promise, winning Spurs our first trophy since 2008. However, him ignoring the league, which would lead to Spurs finishing in 17th place, the lowest in the Premier League era, would not be taken well by Levy and his board, who would be constantly booed by the fans during the season. And this led to them sacking Postecoglou and replacing him with Thomas Frank, which would turn out to be an even bigger disaster, but one which Daniel Levy would only experience the start of it, as he would be sacked in September 2025. Although not before one of the most frustrating windows where Spurs will miss out on a lot of their top targets for various reasons. If we were to summarize the major reasons for failing of Daniel Levy since 2018, they would be the following. First, the rigid wage structure that led to Spurs capping the wages to 100,000 or 200,000. Then second, a lack of a clear strategy going into the transfer market, resulting in Spurs being waiting for a long time to get in their signings and a lot of time missing out of their top targets. Moving from one manager to another manager without a clear philosophy and sometimes making complete U-turns on the style of football. For example, from Postecoglou to Thomas Frank, going from all-out attacking football to complete pragmatism. And this all was due to the fourth and the main reason, that was lack of a proper vision. In Daniel Levy's interview after sacking Postecoglou, he said he wants to win the league, he wants to win Champions League, but he never put in a clear timeline on how he's going to achieve it or a clear plan on it, and that clearly showcased a lack of proper vision that he had for the club. Daniel Levy post 2018 was unable to adapt to the changing landscape of football, where the rising broadcast revenue allowed more than just the top clubs to spend big on wages. And Levy coupled it with an unclear vision of what the club should achieve and how it should play on the pitch, led to the decline we saw in the last 7 years. This was the part 1 of Daniel Levy's fall at Tottenham, in which we covered an historical sequence of events. In part 2, we will cover 3 of the major reasons which led to this failure, the 3 main issues with Daniel Levy. And in part 3, we will look at the other side, the things that he got right and what may in the future help Spurs to achieve the things that he dreamed of achieving. So, thanks for watching.